All right. Okay, I think we're ready to start. So, good afternoon, everybody. Dear students, friends of the Tower Center, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our 2025 National Security Symposium. My name, for those of you who do not know me yet, is Fabrizio Coticchia. I'm a professor here in the Political Science Department at SMU, and I direct the National Security Program at the Tower Center. So this symposium is our yearly flagship event in national security, and the topic, as you all know, presumably, is this year U.S. military alliances, right? The state of alliances. Where do we stand? Where do we go from here? What are the challenges ahead? And we've brought together a really, I think, first-rate group of scholars, of experts for you today. And I'm confident that we'll all come away from today's event enriched. So to introduce the symposium, let me just emphasize that the story of U.S. military alliances is undoubtedly, to my mind, a great success story. Right? The global network of U.S. military alliances has served the United States extraordinarily well since the 1950s. So first and foremost, the U.S. alliance network, perhaps unsurprisingly to most of you, has helped maintain international peace and stability, helped dissuade, helped deter, right, the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and more recently, other great power adversaries from using force in ways contrary to American interests in Europe, in Asia, and elsewhere. And U.S. alliances continue to deter great power adversaries today, of course, first and foremost, Russia and of course, China. Second, and perhaps less appreciated, the U.S. alliance network has been a great source of global influence for the United States. Allies in Europe and in Asia have more often than not supported major U.S. policy initiatives, whether in the security realm, but also in matters of global trade and finance, for example. And I think it's really helpful, therefore, to think of America's alliance network as a catalyst of American power and influence at the global level. Third, I said alliances help deter adversaries. At the same time, they have also helped reassure allies, right? This has, for example, helped limit the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Because allies such as Germany or Japan and South Korea, confident that the United States would protect them, have chosen to forego the proliferation, the development of nuclear weapons. They have not developed their own nuclear weapons, partly because of those American security guarantees. And fourth and finally, of course, standing alliances make it much easier to put together a military coalition in a crisis situation. Right? So allies in Europe and in Asia, in the Pacific, have actively supported the United States in most of its major wars since the 1950s, right? In the Korean War, in the Persian Gulf War, in the Kosovo War, more recently in the Afghanistan War. This has provided the United States first with much needed legitimacy, greater legitimacy globally. Legitimacy matters even for a superpower, and it has also naturally helped the United States share operational burdens in combat. Now, alliances do, of course, also have costs, right, in terms of, for example, supporting smaller allies in faraway places. And I'm sure we'll talk more about the actual and perceived costs of alliances in the course of our discussions today. But to me, once again, the benefits clearly, unambiguously outweigh the costs. Ultimately, U.S. alliances have always been based on an implicit bargain. The United States, as the superpower, as the most powerful member of the alliance network, would shoulder a disproportionate share of the collective defense burden. And in exchange for that, the United States gained acceptance of its leadership role within the network of alliances, gained influence over the foreign and sometimes even over the domestic policies of its allies, and it gained global influence and legitimacy. That has been the bargain for the last 7 decades or so. But today, as you will know if you follow the news, that bargain is being questioned in Washington, including, of course, by the president himself. Support for US alliances remains fairly strong in the Congress, but it is less strong in the administration and especially in the White House. And so US alliances are today facing a period of uncertainty. And there is the potential that a weakening of US alliances could embolden great power adversaries like Russia and China in particular. So I think that now, perhaps more than ever, is really a great time for a deep scholarly dive into the topic of US military alliances to help us better understand how alliances have served American interests, how US alliances are evolving, and what might lie ahead. So before leaving you then to our first panel today, I would just like to introduce our two moderators for our two afternoon panels. And these moderators are themselves, in fact, experts on the topic of US military alliances. First, here to my right, we have General Steve Shepro, who will moderate our first panel on NATO. Shepro is a retired Air Force Lieutenant General. Shepro actually served as a senior leader in the Atlantic Alliance at NATO, so we could hardly have wished for a better person to moderate our first panel. So from 2016 to 2019, I think Shepro served as deputy chairman of the military committee at NATO. That's the most senior military structure in the alliance, and in this role, he was a senior advisor to the NATO Secretary General. He also helped steer policy, strategy, and decision-making at NATO headquarters. General Shepro was commissioned in 1984 as a distinguished graduate of the US Air Force Academy. He is also an Olmsted Scholar, fluent in several languages, including German, Italian, and French. He has commanded multiple operational wings, groups, and squadrons, and he led frontline battlefield airmen in the 2003 Iraq War. Shepro has also served in senior roles on the Joint Staff at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and at the Air Staff, working on strategy, policy, on training, on global partnerships. And finally, and very importantly, Shepro is a fellow here at the Tower Center, where he supports our students, and he's also a senior mentor for the NATO Defense College in Europe. Then I'll also introduce our second moderator for the later panel, who will be Admiral Patrick Walsh, who will moderate the second panel on Asia and the Pacific. And Admiral Walsh is a distinguished naval leader and strategist with a career spanning over 3 decades of service. He's a native of Dallas, who earned then a Master of Arts and subsequently a PhD from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. And during his naval career, Admiral Walsh held several key operational and command positions, including leadership of the Fifth Fleet, of Naval Forces Central Command, and perhaps most relevant to the panel that he'll be chairing, of the US Pacific Fleet. He also served as the 35th Vice Chief of US Naval Operations. He has held strategic assignments at the White House, on the Joint Staff, and at the Naval Academy, where he chaired the Department of Leadership, Ethics, and Law. And Admiral Walsh's many awards include the Distinguished Service Medal, the Defense Superior Service Medal, the Legion of Merit, among others. So General Shepro and Admiral Walsh, thank you very much on behalf of the entire Tower Center team for so generously agreeing to moderate our 2 panels this afternoon. I'm sure you'll share then also some of your own insights about military alliances. Let me just note in conclusion that unfortunately 2 of our speakers, Sten Renning and Victor Cha, unfortunately canceled 2 days ago, fairly late in the day. So due to potential disruption in air travel, there's nothing we could do about it, unfortunately, at such a late stage. That simply means that we will have more time for discussion with the distinguished experts who are here today, the 4 panelists, the 2 moderators, and then the keynote speaker tonight. So I'll stop here. Thanks again very much to all of you for being here, and let's get started with the first panel.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be part of this important panel. I'd like to introduce the two speakers that will be on stage today. First, Jason Davidson is a professor at the University of Mary, Washington. He's a non-resident senior fellow at Atlantic Council's Transatlantic Security Initiative in the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. He's also professor of political science and international affairs and director of the Security and Conflict Studies program at the University of Mary, Washington in Fredericksburg, Virginia. He's an author of 5 books, NATO After Russia's Invasion of Ukraine, Italian Foreign Policy during Matteo Renzi's government, Origins of Revisionist and Status-quo States, America's Allies in War in Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Iraq, and America's Entangling Alliances, 1778 to the present. His articles have been published in peer-reviewed academic journals such as Foreign Policy Analysis, Cambridge Review of International Affairs, Contemporary Security Policy, Modern Italy, Security Studies, and the Nonproliferation Review. And welcome, Jason Davidson. And to his left, Heidi Hardt. It's nice to welcome you, Associate Professor at the University of California, Irvine. She's an associate professor of political science there and is a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council. Her research focuses on NATO, US and European security, alliance politics, organizational change, learning, international organizations, gender and climate security. Heidi has authored 2 books, NATO's Lessons in Crisis, Institutional Memory and International Organization, and Time to React, the Efficiency of International Organizations in Crisis Response. Her scholarship appears or is forthcoming in edited volumes in journals including Security Studies, Journal of Politics, Political Science and Politics, PLOS ONE, European Journal of International Relations, International Politics, Review of International Organizations, Contemporary Security Policy, European Security, and others. NSF, Fulbright, NATO, Carnegie, IGCC have funded her research, and as CFR International Affairs Fellow, she worked for the State Department at the NATO desk and for a U.S. Senator and U.S. Congresswoman. She completed her CFR term membership, has been a Fulbright Schumann Scholar, and is on the executive board of the World Affairs Council of Orange County. Please join me in welcoming 2 distinguished guests. I'm very glad to have them.
Thank you, General. And thank you, Stefano, for the kind invitation. And thank you all for coming today. I believe we're where's the backspace button? There we go. So I want to take you back in time in terms of talking about NATO today to the summer of 2022. So this was just a few months after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And NATO got together for a summit, as they do every summer these days. And they were formulating, they had already been formulating for quite some time, their strategic concept document. And this is sort of the big document that NATO uses to organize itself over a decade generally. And that document has at its core the alliance's perception of the world. What does the world look like? Is the world threatening to NATO? And if so, how? And then goes on to discuss what to do about it. So you see here the statement: the Russian Federation is the most significant and direct threat to Allied security and to peace and stability in the Euro-Atlantic area. This was a significant change over the previous document, the 2010 document. So you might take away from this, and indeed many did in the think tank world, in the journalistic world, in the policy world, that NATO was, as many said at the time, more united than ever, more cohesive than ever, and focused on the threat that Russia poses. And I think there is something to that, right? But the reality that I'm going to discuss is a little bit more complex. So what I'm going to be discussing with you all today is based on 98 elite interviews that I conducted in 2023 and 2024 in 6 NATO capitals with 6 NATO allies. You'll see here Poland, Germany, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, and the United States. And in each of those capitals, in discussing these things with either current policymakers, recently retired policymakers, and analysts, the first and single most important question I asked was, what is the most important security threat that your country faces? And what I heard was that there is a significant difference across these 6 allies in threat perceptions and the levels of threat that these countries face. Now, this is not to say, what I'm not saying at the outset is that NATO is in grave peril. What I am saying is that there are some challenges that NATO faces, and we need to be upfront and clear about those challenges if we want to think about how NATO best moves forward. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each of these 6 countries, and I'm going to briefly note their threat perception. Then I'm going to talk even more briefly, and we could talk about it more in question and answer if folks are interested, about the way that that threat perception affects their military spending, their military structure, and their military posture. In the book, I also look at how their threat perceptions affect, for example, their ideas about what NATO's big challenges as an alliance are moving forward. And I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A, but for brevity's sake, I'm not going to be discussing it for the rest of the discussion. And then when I've done all that, I'm going to talk briefly about the challenges that the Trump administration has posed towards the alliance, how the European allies have reacted, and then some suggestions about how the alliance as a whole might move forward, given everything else that I will have outlined. So first of all, Poland. This is really the easiest and the most straightforward story that I could tell you today, which is that when I was in Poland, I met with people from a variety of political perspectives, and they all said Russia is the single most important threat that we face. It's an existential threat. It's a threat to Poland's security. Part of that is, of course, and this is why I have a map up there. The map is slightly outdated, by the way, because, of course, you will know that Sweden and Finland are no longer seeking NATO membership, but they are, in fact, NATO members. But the reason why I like this map is because it shows Russia in red, and that's sort of dramatic. But beyond that, you can see also very clearly, because of the colors, Kaliningrad there on Poland's northern border. Right, so Poland shares a border with Russia. This is a huge part. It's certainly not the only reason. There is a history there, and we could talk about that more if folks are interested. But Poland shares its direct border with Russia, and they do see Russia very much as an existential threat. I heard people, for example, telling me that when the war broke out, people were packing bags just in case they had to leave in the middle of the night. That after Russia took Ukraine, that they would move into Poland. So how does this affect Poland's major defense decisions like defense spending, military structure, and military posture? Again, the most straightforward story that I could tell you, which is that Poland is spending a lot of its GDP on defense. They're willing to make sacrifices to spend a lot on their defense, right? These figures, by the way, that I'm going to run through are from the SIPRI Yearbook 2024. We talk about the NATO figures, and they're a little bit different, but that's just so people understand what I'm referring to here. But this is by far the highest that we will see. And Poland spending even more in 2025 by all accounts. Their military structure is focused on territorial defense. What do I mean by military structure? Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, but here it's really obvious. Poland has a lot of tanks. Why do they need a lot of tanks? They need a lot of tanks to potentially repel a full ground assault from Russia. Their military posture. Military posture just means where do they keep their troops or other military forces. And in this case, it means that they are focused on the eastern flank of NATO. They are focused on directing and countering that threat from Russia. So Germany gets a little bit more complicated. And on the one hand, it shouldn't, because what I heard in Germany as well is that Russia is the most important threat facing Germany. Also, I did not hear the level of consensus that I heard, and say a little bit more about that later if folks are interested. But for now, we'll say that there was a perception, that, and I would say that definitely the most common perception, that Russia is the threat. But what I don't have here that was on a previous slide is that the these different allies, their perceptions of themselves, we refer in international relations, their identity, their view of themselves also matters here. And in this particular case, it won't be surprising for you to hear that Germany, because of its history in the two world wars, and particularly the Second World War, has a profound current of pacifism in that country. And that pacifism has limited the way that Germany, so far at least, has reacted to the Russian threat. Now, I believe, and this is also based on my interviews, that Germany is confronting this challenge, that they will move forward in a positive direction to confront this threat. But this is part of why the German reaction has not been quite as intense as it was in the Polish case. So defense spending is still low. It's higher than that, by the way, again, projected in 2025, but this is the 2024 figure. Their military structure is moving toward territorial defense, and their military posture is also focused on the eastern flank. Again, Germany, haven't said this yet, but Germany previously had a lot of troops, for example, in Afghanistan as part of the ISAF mission, and these days, almost all of their troops are at home or in, for example, they are deploying a brigade. It's not fully deployed yet, but they are deploying a brigade to Lithuania, and that's going to be a major move for them. What about Britain, and why do I have a big picture of a submarine up here? What I found as I was conducting these interviews, that in the UK, again, not as robust a consensus as in Poland, but still a perception of concern with Russian threat. But when I said before about levels of threat, for the UK, and next I'm going to talk about France, the level of threat is down a few notches from what I heard in Poland and in Germany. Why is that? The nuclear weapons that are on those submarines. In London, the view is our nuclear arsenal, our independent nuclear arsenal, so Britain and France are the two NATO members that have independent arsenals other than the United States. The view in London is our independent arsenal means that Russia's not going to mess with us directly. And therefore, the concern in London is European security more broadly, not any direct Russian military assault on the UK. So defense spending in that medium category. Now, to talk about military structure and military posture, and again, I'll mention this as a challenge that NATO faces moving forward. The UK has a hybrid or mixed military structure and a global military posture. These are not things that make sense from the perspective of fearing Russia. When I say hybrid, what do I mean? I mean that they still have a military that is designed to be able to send small numbers of troops abroad in a crisis situation, a peace operations type situation. They have a military that is designed to engage in a limited amount of airstrikes, as they did in Libya in 2011. And then they have some naval forces that are designed to protect Britain's maritime security. So it's a mix. It's not a military that is focused on combating and fighting Russia moving forward. Their military posture. The UK has large contingents of troops in Brunei, in Cyprus, right? They have troops around the world that reflect part of their history. Again, we academics would say their identity. They're not directly reflective of the threats that they face today. And when I talk to people in the UK, they admitted in many cases that this was in fact the case, that their posture and their structure was not ideal for the threat environment that they faced, but they also admitted that it was something that had been there for a long time and it was hard to change. In the French case, and admittedly, this is a little less intimidating of a picture of a nuclear submarine than the previous one. Yes, it's right. Yes, exactly. But nonetheless, I heard something surprisingly similar in Paris to what I heard in London on a certain level, which is, yes, Russia is the most important threat that we face. However, the threat that we face from Russia is limited, it's buffered by the fact that we have an independent nuclear arsenal. That provides the territorial integrity protection for France because we can control our own destiny in that particular way. So French defense spending has not been as high as you, I think, would otherwise see if they didn't have this nuclear arsenal. And like Britain, they have, as I mentioned, this hybrid military structure that is at least in part designed with helicopters and other military means designed to be able to allow them to intervene in places. They were just in the Sahel region in Africa until not too long ago. And then they have troops deployed throughout the world. Now, a lot of that is also based on the fact that France considers many territories around the world, from South America to the South Pacific, as part of French sovereign territory. But then they also have forces deployed in Africa and places like Djibouti in large numbers. So thousands and thousands of troops throughout the world. Now, up until now, we've heard 4 allies, and 4 allies all concerned with Russia, just slightly different gradations. Well, Italy is also an ally that we need to consider. One of the top 6 allies, both in terms of military size and in terms of military spending. And what I heard in Rome, very consistent over time, by the way. I was just there again in May, and I heard the same thing. Number 1 threat that Italy faces is not Russia. It is instability from the wider Mediterranean, they refer to it as. And that leading to all kinds of things that are bad for Italy, including terrorism, but also irregular migration, narco-trafficking, other sorts of problems. Because the concern with Italy is the wider Mediterranean and not Russia, and I think we probably all would agree that the solution to this problem is not spending a lot more on your military, the Italians don't feel any urgency in terms of spending a lot more on their military. And so as of 2024, as you see there, they were at a little over 1.5%. By the way, for those of you who are following this very closely, Italy now claims that it is spending 2% of its GDP on defense, but has not actually passed any new allotment of resources. Mostly what they've done is an accounting switch, where they're counting things like the Coast Guard as part of their military spending that previously they weren't counting as part of their military spending. So we come back to that. Their military structure is expeditionary. It is focused not on defending Italy against any sort of external aggression. It is focused overwhelmingly on being able to send troops abroad. There are some 11,000 plus Italian troops abroad around the world in over 20 countries. I believe it's 24 countries at last count. Large contingents, for example, in Kosovo, in Lebanon. There are some on the NATO's eastern flank in Bulgaria, for example, as well. But they're really throughout the world engaging in peace and stabilization operations, which in many of those places are in the Mediterranean. So in Italy's case, a little bit more consistent in terms of where their troops are deployed, as well as the military structure that they have. And then finally, of the 6 allies, the United States. Again, I heard a pretty strong consensus and a bipartisan consensus, 2023, 2024. China is the single most important security threat that the United States faces. This was present in a lot of documents. And rather than give you somebody from the Biden administration, which I have in the book, since we know that that's no longer particularly relevant, just so happens that I interviewed somebody at the time who will remain anonymous, because at the time they were working in a think tank, but now they are in the Trump administration at a relatively senior level. And you've got a quote there from them that this was the case. So across the aisle, a variety of different perspectives, and I heard that China is the most important security threat the United States faces. This then makes, everything here makes perfect sense according to this relatively high level of defense spending, which you need if you're going to combat the world's second largest economy, the world's second largest military spender. You're going to need a military structure focused on peer competition. And then you're going to want to have a global military structure posture, which is, the posture is designed and increasingly moving toward emphasis on the Indo-Pacific. Okay, what about the Trump administration, and what's different relative to what I've just discussed? Because as I said, I did conduct these interviews through 2024, and you might say, as for a brief moment, my editor did right after the election, gee, is this book still relevant? It's available on Amazon, by the way. So first of all, we had in early in the administration, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence puts out every year an annual threat assessment, and this is from the annual threat assessment. China stands out as the actor most capable of threatening U.S. interests globally. By the way, I'll go ahead and mention, just last week, there were a series of Pentagon officials engaging in hearings on Capitol Hill for appointments, and you heard again from the most senior person on that committee that China is the United States' pacing challenge. It is its peer competitor. Now, the thing that's different is drug cartels have also been added to this list. I don't think it really affects the equation, but I can talk about that more later. And we'll see in terms of how it affects the resources that the United States deploys to different parts of the world. The U.S.'s European security policy has changed, I think, much more in tone than thus far in substance in terms of where we are with the Trump administration thus far. So you see this quote from Secretary Hegseth this is from February of this year, saying that the United States can't be primarily focused on the security of Europe because it has to be focused on the Indo-Pacific, because it has to put more resources into countering China. Now, I was not surprised by that speech at all. It got a lot of attention, both in Washington and a lot of attention in Europe. I didn't think it was should have been as surprising as many people seem to be surprised by it. And then the other big development of the Trump administration is the administration's successful push at the Hague Summit this past summer to get allies to agree to 3.5% of GDP spent on defense plus an additional 1.5 on related. This makes sense, again, from the perspective, if the United States is going to focus more on the Indo-Pacific, and specifically if it's going to move its forces more toward the Indo-Pacific, that means Europeans are going to have to do more for themselves, right? Even if the United States stays engaged in NATO, which the administration has said that it will. So both of those things make good sense, but they do pose challenges, particularly given some of the things that I noted before about some of the allies. How have the allies reacted? Well, Poland's fine. The only thing Poland is really concerned about is keeping the United States engaged, because as we'll discuss in just a second, we'll get to the next slide, there are things that the United States provides to the alliance that only it can provide at this moment in time to as critical enablers. We'll talk about that in a second. So Poland definitely wants the United States engaged. Germany, on the one hand, I think there is increasing consensus in Germany that this threat needs to be addressed, but there is still this problem of pacifism that I mentioned. You see that both in more fringe parties like the Alternative for Deutschland Party, but also in this, sadly, in my view, in the Social Democrats as well. And I think that's going to be a challenge moving forward. From the French case, as we said, we haven't seen a dramatic increase in defense spending in the French case as a reaction to Trump. And that's somewhat puzzling. And I, again, think that the reason is that their independent nuclear arsenal gives them additional confidence for their own security. In the UK's case, it's different. And the reason is that the United Kingdom relies on the United States for its nuclear deterrent. The submarine technology comes from the United States. And so Britain needs the United States engaged, and that is its focus. So the U.S. is doing whatever it can to keep the United States on board. And then finally, my own prediction is that Italy, while Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has committed to the 3.5% target, Italy will struggle, both from its own internal economic and financial constraints, but also because the public just really doesn't see the need for it, and there really hasn't been an attempt to educate the public. Which leads me to my suggestions. So I really hope, first of all, that the United States can find a way to work with the Europeans, that as we do shift toward Europe, toward the Indo-Pacific and away from Europe, that we work with the Europeans to help them set timelines and develop plans for developing the capabilities that they need, like intelligence capabilities, like referred to as long-range fires, other sorts of, air-to-air refueling capabilities that they've relied on the United States for many, many years and can no longer, I think, do so into the extended future. And then second of all, that the United States should more frequently affirm its commitment to Article 5 of NATO, that an attack on one is an attack on all. For example, I think perfect opportunity would have been during these recent, in September, these Russian incursions into Polish airspace would have been a great occasion to do that, and it was a missed opportunity. What about the Europeans? Well, the Germans, the British, and the French need to focus more on convincing their publics. There's a German general, Stolman, who lately has been really making this case in, I think, very dramatic way to the public, and hopefully will be effective over time. But you need to be out there making the case to the public of why they need to be spending more on defense. You need to be talking about the threat that Russia poses. And by the way, Vladimir Putin's helping out in this capacity, because the more he engages in this reckless activity with drones, the more the publics are coming to see the light. And then finally, I do think there's been some criticism of the Europeans that they were too obsequious with Trump, that they've done too much. You know, the Rutte, the Secretary General, calling him daddy, for example. I think that the Europeans should be doing whatever's necessary to keep the United States on board from a security perspective until they can really provide more for their defense on their own. Thank you. Look forward to your comments.
Hello, everyone. I hope you're all doing well today. As you heard, my name is Heidi Hardt. I'm a political science professor at University of California, Irvine. And I too, like the other members of this panel, am very, very fascinated by NATO. And I'm working on a new book project, tentative title, NATO Transforms, Alliance Adaptation After Global Crisis. So you'll also be hearing from me about some of the field work that I've been doing. Your work, Professor Davidson's work is already out. Mine is still in progress, but I definitely have some questions during the Q&A, so looking forward to that portion of this session. So in the fall of 2021, scholars, policymakers, experts, leaders were really scrambling to try to figure out what Putin's end goal was. We had a military exercise that somehow didn't end up returning troops and equipment and everything back home. And at the time, I was working for Senator Van Hollen, doing foreign policy advising as part of a fellowship. You know, many of the briefings that we were sitting in on were really focused on trying to figure out this question of, you know, what's going to happen to this column of tanks? Is this really just a bluff that Putin is using? Is it going to be used for leverage? Or is the end game actually, you know, what many of us feared, right? Full-scale invasion of Ukraine. However, by February 2022, at that time, my security clearance had finally come through, and I was finally able to take up the actual job that I was hired for, which was to work at the NATO desk of the US State Department at the time under the Biden administration. And the answer was very clear, right? This is a photo from a month after the invasion. You see March 2022 in Mariupol, and the assault was ruthless. Right? Now we are 3 years out of this invasion, 13,000 civilian casualties, refugees around the world. Of course, a lot of those refugees are concentrated in you know, many of the countries bordering Ukraine. We have refugees here. If you end up going to Canada, you'll meet many refugees, lots of different programs set up to support them. But for NATO, right, the neighboring, Europe's premier security alliance, we could say this invasion, as you heard in the previous remarks, was an absolute shock. Ukraine was not only a neighboring country, but the other thing to keep in mind is that Ukraine is a country that had been a longtime partner of the alliance. Very close partner, training together, etc. And for Ukrainians, this was not the start of the war, right? If you ask any Ukrainian, they will say, no, the war started in 2014 with the illegal annexation of Crimea. But at the time, working on the NATO desk, interesting, I appreciate that you brought up the strategic concept. That was one of the things that we were working on. And that particular piece, that line that you presented was something that was really a source of controversy within the administration, right? Different offices kind of going back and forth. What is the appropriate way to describe our new relationship with Russia moving forward? And also, how do we downgrade Russia from being a partner? Because it turns out that actually, even all the way up until 2022, officially on the books, Russia was still a partner, an official partner of NATO. And of course, that all needed to change. So immediately right out the gate, this was a rallying opportunity for the alliance. Everyone very clearly was on board that we needed to defend this and support this the sovereignty of Ukraine, that we needed to make sure that the Secretary General's statements that were coming out were unequivocal in that support. And so one of the things that started happening at that point internally was different considerations of how can the alliance start to adapt in relation to this new threat that we're seeing, right? This shock. This is not, something where I remember I was doing interviews for my first book on NATO, and visiting different delegations, and some of the delegations at NATO headquarters in Brussels had pictures outside their delegations of the quote unquote little green men to try to convince the other allies, hey, this is serious, right? This really is, these really are Russian soldiers that are coming in as part of this attack, because there were a lot of questions about, well, is this threat really serious? Is this maybe just a civil war that's going on, right? Is it really about Russia or not? And so now all of a sudden in 2022, there were no questions, right? The intentions of the Russian Federation were very clear, and suddenly countries like Poland and Estonia, the Baltic countries, were suddenly getting the ear of many of those big four, those big countries that we just heard about in Dr. Davidson's presentation. So this really motivated me to ask this kind of broader question about, well, not just how does NATO adapt, but why does it adapt, right? Like, what are some of maybe the drivers behind adaptation? And I won't, go through all of this, but I would just say really quickly that from a scholarly perspective, adaptation is something that we don't completely understand. If we look at NATO in particular, we do know that it's very important for performance. So if you look at other types of organizations, maybe even SMU or universities, we know that that matters for effectiveness. It also matters for alliance effectiveness. And of course, it matters for survival, right? We're all taxpayers here. And so our taxpayer dollars contribute to the US budget, and less than 0.1% of the US defense budget goes to supporting NATO and keeping the lights on, and of course, supporting the common budget and the work that they do there. So if constituents don't believe that NATO matters or is important and is not successfully adapting and changing to the threats and the changing threat environment, then what does that mean for kind of the survival of the alliance itself more broadly? Unfortunately, we also know that I would just say that adaptation is something that's very difficult, right, and costly. And so this is why we kind of want to understand what are some of the barriers, what are the drivers behind this. So in political science, as social sciences, we like to focus on a puzzle. So what does the scholarship tell us about how things should look versus how they actually look in practice? And so if you look at some of the organizational change literature, the assumption is that if you have some sort of big shock, that typically organizations should react to that, especially if you think about the shock being, more important. So you can think of like the Challenger crisis in 1983, or Kodak, if you remember, kind of the outgoing why Kodak as a company didn't quite succeed. It was unsuccessful in adapting. And so adaptation is really important to these kind of big shocks that happen to all sorts of organizations. And from the alliance literature, we also know that external threats matter, right? And this can affect allies differently depending on the nature of how allies, as we were hearing in the previous presentation, how that threat perception may differ slightly. But we still don't have really an answer to this question of why NATO specifically adapts. There was, I reference here some literature that may be relevant, but we still kind of see this gap specifically on NATO. So my question after global crises, why do we sometimes see NATO adapting? Sometimes do we see it accommodating? So thinking of kind of moderate or partial adaptations, and sometimes stagnating. So some of the key terms just to kind of help us out with definitions. So generally, I'm thinking about adaptation. We could spend a lot of time thinking about different types of adaptation. Adaptation at maybe the real tactical level. I was listening to a CSIS talk this morning on battlefield adaptation, a lot of conversations about drone adaptations that are happening even in people's garages, right? The minute the drone arrives, and then within a matter of weeks, it shows up on the ground, and then the country being able to adapt that technology, kind of deprogram the the drone, and you know, figure out how you can respond as these two countries are going back and forth with the drone technologies and the innovations that are coming out there. I'm interested in thinking about adaptation more at a strategic level, right, as opposed to that really more tactical battlefield level. And I'm really interested when I talk about global crises as these big exogenous large-scale events. You could argue a lot of things are crises, but are they all relevant maybe to the alliance? Well, you know, not necessarily, right? If it's something kind of that's out of area, farther away, maybe not relevant to the particular allies, and particularly their interests. So I put forward an argument, also something that in political science for students in the room, maybe you see this quite a bit, a 2x2, that I think two things are really important here. One of them is I'm introducing an argument that's somewhat counterintuitive, which is that the proximity of the crisis itself to the organization, the closer that crisis is to the organization's core mission, will actually make it less likely to adapt. Part of the reason that I'm suggesting that is because absolutely, as we saw or as I guess I personally experienced, and a lot of people, you know, in the room were reading about in the news, absolutely NATO in that moment needed to signal externally to the world that NATO's back, right? Charles Kupchan had a piece in Foreign Affairs all about, you know, the new NATO, and you know, certainly me going to conferences where very few people were in the room on NATO panels, that changed. Now NATO is certainly more relevant. But internally, what I was observing as kind of a participant observer is something very different. The focus instead was, can we do whatever we can to try to maintain alliance cohesion for the sake of survival so that we don't risk further disruption among the alliance at this really critical time, right? So in this moment, we need to do everything we can to try to maintain unity within the alliance for the sake of the survival. And so this is why I suggest that actually in these moments of crisis, in the aftermath of these crises, which is what I'm focusing on the book, that we should expect to see actually very some accommodations. So that would be in this kind of you know, bottom right quadrant here, moderate accommodation, and I'll talk about the other signal in a minute. But that we should see some accommodation, some changes, maybe some repackaging of existing initiatives, so that we can externally, you know, tell folks we're really adapting and things are moving and changing. So, you know, including the line that you saw about the strategic concept, and certainly we saw a bolstering of the eastern flank, and you saw the doubling of the multinational battalions. So I just want to be really clear. I'm not trying to suggest that nothing changed, but rather the changes that happened were not on, say, the scale that we might expect from the way the literature talks about shocks and the impacts of those shocks. And that, in fact, you know, efforts were made internally to try to, like I said, take things that might already exist and kind of reconfigure them if possible, so that we make sure that all of those, you know, political challenges that exist, barriers, things like difficulties on managing EU-NATO relations, or what is the priority list for NATO on threats? Should it be, you know, for countries in the South, right? Should it be counterterrorism and maritime security? Or should we be focused, you know, for the countries on the East, should we be focused more on, you know, prioritizing Russia and the risk of further Russian aggression, especially with, you know, these kind of imperialist ambitions and the risk that, well, who's going to be next? Is it going to be Estonia, or is it going to be Poland, et cetera? Or should we be prioritizing China, right? So those kind of differences were something that allies really wanted to nip in the bud. The other aspect of this argument that I make is that it really does matter if you have one ally in the alliance who is pushing for this, right? So if you don't have a clear picture of who the lead state is, or sometimes they're referred to as the lead nation, then it's really easy for a lot of these discussions, these deliberations that are happening in all sorts of places, right? They may be happening at, you know, committee meetings in NATO headquarters in Brussels. They may be happening at SHAPE. They may be happening in the corridors, in the coffee shops, at NATO headquarters. But for these things to actually roll out and become a reality, where you're able to get the political will of now 32 countries, right, because Sweden and Finland joined on board, you need a country that's really driving and pushing that adaptation. And so if you don't have that, it's very difficult for any kind of big changes to move forward, which is why I suggest that, adaptation in that top right quadrant does require some sort of strong signal of, yes, there's somebody who's willing to push this. But like I said, that the proximity, it's actually can be better if you're working in issue areas that maybe are considered less central to NATO. This is a moment to just reflect, especially for those of you in the room who maybe are not as familiar with NATO, on what exactly is NATO's core mission, right? So what is NATO's purpose, right? Well, NATO, of course, historically, you may know very well, is, product of the Cold War, right? Initially designed as a form of deterrence, as we were hearing from your remarks. But what it has now, kind of evolved into is not just simply an alliance that's focused on collective defense. It also has two other core tasks, and those other core tasks are cooperative security. So that has to do with things like working with partners and making sure our partner countries, whether those partners are Jordan or whether those partners are Japan or South Korea or Australia, et cetera, helping them build up their defenses and improve the quality of the security that they're providing to their citizens, but also crisis management, right? NATO's 2 decades of presence, activities, 2 operations, ISAF, resolute support in Afghanistan. Libya was referenced earlier as well, right? Those are all fall within crisis management. And so what I'm arguing is that there can be an advantage to these other core tasks that we think about as being informally more peripherally, even though technically the strategic concepts don't say it that way. Strategic concepts, the earlier strategic concepts have suggested that these 3 core tasks are kind of in the same area. But informally, we have a sense, I think we would probably agree, that collective defense is the pinnacle of NATO's mission. So this is this kind of perceived hierarchy that I'm putting forward in those core tasks. And so my argument is that we should first see the crisis occur. Then allies, of course, are reflecting on their own interests. What are their own, priorities in terms of the threats that they're looking at? And then, they're thinking about that proximity to NATO's mission, right? How close is this to NATO's mission? And then looking for ways, if it is closer to collective defense, to again, externally project strength, which is also important not just for the constituents I had mentioned for taxpayers, but it's also important for signaling in a deterrence perspective, right? So it's important that Russia in particular understands that, when something like the Polish, the drones over Poland, these 20 drones, or the incursions in airspace in Estonia happen, that Russia is receiving a very clear unified signal from allies that threat is being taken seriously. So there's also, advantages there as well. I want to say again, because this is pretty preliminary, I've interviewed 65 officials thus far, but I have teams of undergraduates coding the interview notes now. So I'm just going to show a few quick interview kind of responses, but I'm not going to be able to unfortunately show you the whole coded package. But this is kind of the main argument that I already went over, which is that I'm expecting to find that when the crisis proximity to the organization's mission is lower, we're more likely to see adaptation, and when the strength of the signal is strong. I look at some competing hypotheses as well, right? A lot of the neorealist literature is reminding us, well, the hegemon matters, right? If that the threat environment matters, and not just the threat environment, but the threat environment, especially for, the country that's considered the most powerful country in the alliance, which of course is the US. So maybe the idea of adaptation is really more likely to happen when, just in cases where the US is putting that pressure on. There's also of course, the alliance dilemma itself. And it may be that, in cases of entrapment, these might be situations where, allies are, especially the big powerful ally, in the case of NATO, it would be the US, is concerned that other allies, say you can think of countries that are maybe on the eastern flank, are going to be emboldened by this security guarantee, and that maybe it could be that in moments when there's this perceived risk or higher risk of entrapment, especially if there's a conflict or kind of political conflict or some sort of dispute that's going on, that between, I guess in this case it would probably be, say, Russia and one of these countries that are on the eastern flank, that maybe that those might be times or points in time where we might expect to see more adaptation, because then the NATO is looking at that as an alliance, and allies are suggesting, well, we need to do something about this to react. You don't need to read all of this. This is very detailed, but just to skim, I have a novel adaptation data set as well from the past 2 decades. I have a team of undergrads who are coding that right now to look at this time period. Just elite interviews, like I already mentioned, and then my own experiences and copious notes from that period of time where I was working in the lead up to, I was working for 2 members of Congress at the time of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which in itself, of course, was a crisis for NATO, and then the crisis of the 22 invasion, and then process tracing some of these different crises. So happy in the Q&A to look at any of these or talk through any of these in more detail. Some of the preliminary results, but like I said, I really want to wait and say, little asterisks in this because I want to wait till the coding's done. But just from my own experience of having looked at, having done the interviews myself, I do see strong support for this from some of the interview evidence that's coming out. On the case of Ukraine, I don't see as much support for that hegemonic explanation. On Afghanistan, one of the things that really came out strongly from those interviews was just how taboo even the mention of the word Afghanistan was in some of these committee meetings and in the corridors. And I think that's important and also really disheartening in a way, right? Because NATO as an alliance learned a lot from those experiences of 2 decades long working together, improving, enhancing interoperability. But because of the timing of when the Ukraine crisis happened in 2022, there was a very quick shift to, we need to now reprioritize collective defense at the cost of, maybe the full implementation of some of those lessons that were coming out of the lessons learned process from Afghanistan. So again, happy to talk more about this. So this is just kind of a filling in of some of these crises and as I'm seeing them and what I'm observing. So in terms of Afghanistan, since I just started to speak about this, what we did see is there was a strategic lessons learned process. There have been kind of different components of it that have been published in unclassified spaces, so you can look online and you will find some pieces of it out there. Not just the one that's internal and classified. There have been changes, some moderate changes, I would say, to security assistance, especially learning from things that I would say were already popping up in SIGAR reports. For those of you who followed the SIGAR report, SIGAR is basically the Special Inspector General, U.S. Special Inspector General on Afghanistan, who had been regularly producing reports and was really important for the accountability in Afghanistan. So some of those things that were showing up in those reports years and years and years ago were then being brought into NATO's approach to thinking about security assistance and the conversations that allies are having about security assistance. We do see in terms of some examples of clear and very obvious adaptations. So Estonia in 2007 was hit by a massive cyber attack. So government buildings, military infrastructure, very, very sweeping and pretty terrifying. So as a result, this is really the reason why we see NATO taking cybersecurity very seriously right now. It ended up creating its own emerging security challenges division that was established. Cyber is an official domain. So if you're familiar with the military, you've got, of course, air, sea, and land. But then you also now have at NATO cyber, right? Cyber is an official domain as well as space. what was going on in Afghanistan in 2012, if you look back at that period, this is shortly after the surge. And right after the surge, there was also a creation of a Ministry of Women's Affairs, and reports on gender-based violence were finally coming out, and this was really being taken seriously within Afghanistan in terms of their own government, but also among allies who were working very closely, with Afghan forces. And so I would argue that one very clear adaptation from that was the creation of a special representative on women, peace, and security. You may be curious, that position still exists. Okay, just if you're curious, that does exist. And in fact, NATO has a bi-strategic directive, which means NATO's two strategic commands agreed as kind of a follow-up to this UN Security Council resolution in 2000 to do gender mainstreaming and kind of implement thinking about gender throughout a lot of the work streams that NATO does. And so a lot of that goes back to that particular period. I'm happy to talk more about some of these in the Q&A. You had actually, Dr. Davidson had already covered some of the adaptations that you were hearing that NATO was engaging with. I had already referenced some of them as well. But maybe I'll just end with, if you want to take a look at some of the quotes. This quote I really appreciate just because it's pretty recent, right? 2025 drones over Poland, great example of moderate accommodation. This is a quote from a NATO military official. And I'm happy to read it, especially for those maybe who are sitting in the back. It says, Eastern Sentry was basically an attempt to cohere things that already existed, polish the stimulus, allowing us to step forward to be coherent. We'll patch up on some of the things, until we need to make them coherent again. It looks like a change, right? These are all questions I'm asking everybody, all these 65 people that I've talked to from across the Alliance about adaptation, barriers to adaptation, examples of adaptations, et cetera. This person said, it looks like a change. We're doing all these things different things to pose problems for the adversary, but we're not actually changing it, right? We were already, NATO was already involved in air policing. This was not something new in that particular case, but rather we're making it streamlined and more coherent. So this is kind of an example of one of those accommodations where, again, you're in a situation where clear high proximity to collective defense in terms of the crisis itself. And because the drones happened in Poland, Poland was clearly, the lead state on that particular example. Again, as I said, happy to go back through any of these later on, but maybe I'll stop there with just emphasizing that I think this is an important contribution to the broader literature on alliance politics, which tends to overlook adaptation in favor of, deterrence and entrapment and signaling. As well as to the international organizations literature, which has kind of prioritized more trade and development and kind of low politics types of changes. Okay, thank you very much.
So our Professor Davidson, thank you very much for that incisive look at NATO. This is fascinating. It's hard to hear that Afghanistan is a taboo subject. We spent so much treasure and so much blood. And my last assignment, operational assignment, was as a NATO commander in Afghanistan. And I will tell you, nothing warmed my heart more than to drive through Kabul and see the number of students that were walking to school, both boy and girl, and just to see the level of just a generation's worth of training and Western and NATO investment in the country. In fact, I flew with the first Afghan female pilot, who was very, very good pilot. All their pilots, their new generation of pilots, Western standard and procedure, safety, security. It really was, we could debate the strategic work that NATO did in Afghanistan, but I will tell you, operationally, I was very impressed and very, very touched by the Allied contribution. We've got 35 minutes for questions and answers. I'm going to abuse my moderator seat and ask the first question because I just found this discussion fascinating. Both of you hit the center of gravity of NATO, and that is cohesion. So Professor Davidson is fascinated by seeing the different views. When I was in NATO, obviously we understood very well that there were different parts of NATO. There was a northern view, a western view, southern view that you outlined well. But that perception is really important. And then Professor Hardt, I think the way you brought in adaptation was very effective because, like you said, that's key to survival of any organism, and especially that way of NATO. So let me start off. I'm going to ask you both thought-provoking question. It'll be a long question because I want to get to the audience question and answers. But Professor Coticchia started by underlining that NATO is considered to be the most successful alliance in history. And there are good reasons to say that. Let me ask you, is it still achieving its mission in light of all of the challenges you underline? What has happened in Ukraine, all of the gray area challenges that we haven't discussed? You know, is it doing its core mission that you highlighted well? Is it deterring? Are we at a state of peace? Or can you argue, are we at something different? And can it deter that important arena of nuclear escalation? Is it really capable of that? You know, the first Secretary General, Lord Ismay, you might know this quote, but so he was asked what the purpose of NATO was, and he said to keep the Russians out, to keep the Americans in, and keep the Germans down. So, is NATO keeping the Russians out? Are they keeping the Americans in? Or are they keeping the Germans down? There was an interesting article in Politico you might have seen about German defense spending and how now Germany could well become, you know, the military juggernaut of NATO to its benefit. But of course, the French ally is worried about that. And, you know, history isn't too far off. So both of you outlined this well. Is NATO still the most successful alliance? Is it accomplishing its mission? And neither of you mentioned the place of the European Union. And I'm curious if you see the military identity of the European Union, obviously the French using it as a platform for strategic autonomy, you know, saying, hey, the US told us, you know, we got to carry the burden. We need to develop our own capability. So we need to start doing this by ourselves, essentially. I just came from the Brussels Defense and Security Conference a couple of weeks ago, and the rhetoric was very strong. So with all that, is NATO still the most successful alliance in history? Start with Professor Davidson.
Thank you, General. Yeah, that was a great set of questions. And so I'm seeing three parts here. That's the way at least I'm going to answer. So the biggest question, is NATO still fulfilling its purpose? And I think the answer is yes, it is. And to me, and I think the best evidence is we have had military aid flowing from Poland to an active participant in a war against Russia for 3 years. And what has Russia done in response to that active flowing of military aid from Poland into Ukraine? And Russia has occasionally sent a few drones across the border, right? Why has Russia not done any more than that? Because of NATO, right? So NATO is fulfilling its overall purpose. Now, I do agree that the challenge moving forward is on the hybrid side. And I think that's going to be a real challenge moving forward is things that fall short of attack, right? And attack is whatever NATO decides it is. But I think there are some things that we could definitively say are attacks, and then there are things that would fall short. So, you know, Russians hiring local actors to use drones to shut down European airports, all right? Pretty hard to justify engaging in a full-scale military response to that. So how does NATO deal with that? I think is a big challenge moving forward. Can NATO continue to deter nuclear use? And I think the answer is unequivocally yes, as long as the United States stays engaged in the alliance, committed to the alliance, and clear that it is willing to come to Europeans' defense. I think it becomes a lot more difficult if the United States is not the primary player there. The French and British nuclear arsenals are too small on their own to protect all of Europe. I think it would entail some change there. Happy to talk, by the way, if folks are interested in the nuclear sharing question. I just heard some interesting presentations a few weeks ago in DC on this, and the Poles, perhaps not surprising, are chomping at the bit to engage in nuclear sharing, for example. And then finally on the EU. My own thought is that the EU is not ready yet for these responsibilities, may not ever be ready for these responsibilities. What I personally think is the best move moving forward, as I sort of implied from my presentation, is that the United States just takes a step back from NATO, but does not leave NATO, and that NATO still provides the best structure for providing for the defense of European security moving forward. I think the best example or the best evidence that we have that the European Union alone doesn't cut it is Finland and Sweden's decisions to join NATO after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Right? Why did they join NATO? Because they knew that NATO was the only way that they could really be secure. Thank you.
Thank you. So I definitely agree on this question about, is it fulfilling its mission? Yes, very simply, take a look at security in Europe right now, right? Yes, the EU won, rightfully so, the Peace Prize, Nobel Peace Prize, for all of its work that it did in developing as an institution and moving from being initially a coal and steel community to now being this incredible supranational institution, technically supranational and intergovernmental institution. But at the end of the day, to go back to some of the threats that we're talking about, such as Russian aggression, you can look at the map and you can see, well, where have the attacks been, right? Georgia 2008, 2014 Crimea, 2022 Kiev, right? The aim was to go for Kiev. And those are all countries that are non-NATO members. Those are countries, Georgia and Ukraine were promised at some point in the future because of the agreement right back in 2008 under the Bush administration and others, that these countries would eventually become NATO members. But right now in this moment, and at the time that those attacks happened, those were not NATO countries. And that's why I'm strongly agreeing on this point that the deterrent effect is working. Right. Also, I would just point out that scholarship, so for those of you who are really interested in alliance politics, work like, by Leeds and Mattis and others have shown pretty decisively that alliances are actually really effective at maintaining intrastate peace as well as interstate peace. So, are we seeing conflicts, to go back to your question about, keeping the Germans down, et cetera. The idea, it's almost laughable to think about France and Germany at war right now. And a big part of that is because of NATO. Part of that is because of the EU and the European Coal and Steel Community, but part of it is also because of Article 5, right? That core commitment in the NATO treaty, also known as the Washington Treaty, that promises if one country is attacked, then other countries will be there to support that country that has been attacked. So that's really, really key, is just thinking about peace on the continent. Now, of course, what we saw in 2022 with this return to full-scale war and full-out war between countries was something that I think a lot of us who study international relations and international politics were hoping optimistically that would not be the case again. But again, Ukraine, unfortunately, I would say deeply unfortunately, was not a member and is not a member of NATO. So that really matters. On some of the other areas, collective defense, crisis management, we don't mention Kosovo enough, but when those flare-ups have happened, and there have been multiple flare-ups in Kosovo, KFOR, which is a NATO's operation in Kosovo that's been there for decades, very quickly increased, troop levels and was ready to support Kosovo in that case. So, we can go back to the 90s and we remember those really vivid images on CNN of the wars in the Balkans. But just to say, I think, yes, it is fulfilling its mission. Yes, it has a long way to go, which is part of the motivation in terms of adaptation. I would just say also that on some of the failures that I'm seeing that I think are really heartbreaking are on combating disinformation, including folks in my classes, we were talking about this last night, who are not really, kind of understanding the history of that war, that's happening in Ukraine, and the failing, I think, NATO's and allies individually failing to successfully combat the disinformation about the role that NATO has played in Ukraine. And unfortunately, NATO's entire public diplomacy division just got absorbed into the international staff. So I'm hearing internally that means, yes, there will still be attempts to kind of counter disinformation, but I don't think they're going to have the same resources as before. On the EU, the EU does not have strategic enablers. The EU does not have, as you alluded to, it does not have a strategic command, right? The example of 2022 is a really great way to be able to see how quickly allies were willing and able to provide authorities to the SACEUR. SACEUR is the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, who conveniently is double-hatted with the role of also being in charge and being the commander of all of Europe for the U.S. military. So in the absence, I would say, of that kind of infrastructure, that command structure, the absence of Article 5. Yes, they have a mutual defense clause, but it's not the same thing. It's not playing the same role, right? It's playing a very, very important role. The EU is very critical for peace, but it's playing a role that's very different from what NATO is providing for European security.
Great, thank you both. Okay, let's go to the audience. Oh, gee, this is great. I'm going to go left to right, sir.
The percentage of, say, what is NATO's focus on China becoming a military supply chain juggernaut to Russia and other bad actors?
So I think, first of all, there's a fascinating question there that I'm going to take the opportunity to address, which is the evolving U.S. perspective on whether Europeans, whether NATO allies should be focused on China at all. So in my view, up until relatively recently, the idea was a mistaken view from the U.S., which was that allies should be present in the Indo-Pacific and they should be doing things to help the United States against China. And I personally think that if we want the Europeans to take care of their own security, probably they should have their military forces closer to home. And they have limited resources and limited focus, and so that's what they should do. Now, to your specific point, however, I do think there is very much a growing concern in Europe about, first of all, China's support for Russia. I think China had a much better, I know China had a much better reputation, perception in many parts of Europe before the Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Since they've been providing so much support to Russia, they've really, really struggled in terms of the public perception and elite perception, and that's not going to change. So that China is much more seen as an enabler of Russia and then an economic threat in Europe than by most Europeans than a military threat to Europe.
The only thing that I would probably add to that is just, a lot of folks in NATO, as is the case in many allies, are concerned about, procurement and, particular components of weapon systems that are being purchased. And what does that mean for the defense industry if some of this equipment is coming over from China? And does that mean there's surveillance? And, the questions about resilience and critical infrastructure are not just about being resilient in the case of a war or an attack or climate threats, but resilience is also questions of, do we have the equipment and do we have the means to engage if there is an attack in a way such that these weapon systems are ultimately secure from external influence, be it from China or others countries.
Okay, per the schedule, we have 12 minutes. I'm going to call an audible if the professor lets me and take 5 minutes of your break. That gives us 17 minutes, and then I'm going to group questions. So I'll take several at a time. So we'll go from left to right. So the two right there next to each other.
I just wanted to ask this because you brought up Professor Hardt brought up the fact that both Georgia and Ukraine were trying to join NATO, or at least get closer to NATO before the Russian invasion. Do you think there's any credence to the Russian claim that Putin has put forward repeatedly that the expansion of Western influence in NATO has resulted in the rising tensions in that region?
Okay, thank you. And next to you.
I just wanted to say a quick thank you both for coming and speaking here, and I just wanted to ask, what does the short-term and long-term future look like for NATO in terms of expansion, and what sort of countries or regions of the world do you think it would potentially expand into?
Good. And one more question, perhaps. Yes, ma'am. In the back. I think the plate's full.
Probably say very similar answers, just being both NATO scholars. So there's lots of really interesting scholarly debate. I would encourage you to check out very lively debate going on for a long time, first in the journal International Security, and then also the Carnegie Endowment has featured Schifrinson and then also Goldgeier, which are two scholars who have kind of like competing views on this question of, was there a promise, right? And what was the nature of that promise long, long ago, right, in the 90s about what the future of NATO and the European security architecture would look like. So I'd encourage you to start with looking at those pieces because those are really, really interesting and you hear kind of those conversations. But I think even in the debates, the scholarly debates, the policy debates about this, everybody generally agrees there was not any evidence of an official written agreement that NATO would never enlarge eastward, and even the choice of language of enlargement versus expansion is kind of debated, right? Because those who use the term expansion consider this kind of, okay, well, that's not. If you were to say expansion within NATO, right, they would disagree with that because, technically it's enlargement officially from the, open door policy perspective. But I would say even if we all agree on that, there wasn't an official written agreement. And then if we say, okay, there's some disputes about what was said, right? And so that's where the scholars really like to get into the weeds because there have been these deep dives into the memos, right, that are, memos that were written by Russian policymakers and memos written by American policymakers. So even if that was the case, let's say hypothetically there was a verbal agreement, right, to say, okay, NATO is never going to enlarge. I think it goes back to, principles of sovereign equality, right, and equality among states. If we stick with the principles of the UN Charter, and we generally agree that it's a bad idea for countries to invade other countries, unprovoked, right? And we stick with that, right? To go back to the UN Charter. And then what's also interesting, I teach on international organizations, is all of these international organizations that are out there, whether you're talking about the Organization of American States, NATO, the European Union, the very first thing, always look at the preamble, the very first thing that they do is they give reference back to that UN Charter. And recognizing that we recognize those principles and that important norm of sovereignty, right, of recognizing the sovereignty of states. And so what's complicated here about what effectively happened in 2022 with this full-scale invasion, not only, I think, is it a moral question, which we have to start with a kind of moral aspect of this, of just, the unleashing of violence on, mass numbers of people and families and children, but also this question of Russia itself, right, as a government, had signed multiple agreements recognizing the the sovereignty of Ukraine, despite Putin's comments now about kind of, for a long time questioning verbally and in some of the strategic documents, the sovereignty of Ukraine, that Ukraine somehow was technically always part of Russia. But if you go back to some of those agreements, it's very clear. I mean, Ukraine never would have given up nuclear weapons, right? Which, okay, we can argue about, well, technically, were they Soviet weapons? They weren't technically Ukraine. But Ukraine never would have agreed to those weapons if Russia had not been one of the countries to give that security guarantee of recognizing that, the territorial integrity of Ukraine is something that's unquestioned. So, there is an open door policy. Countries can meet that. We could debate whether certain countries have met the criteria or not. But at the end of the day, I look at it from a very simple perspective, which is one country invaded another country in a situation where we didn't see, or at least I didn't read any intelligence or see anything. And from what we've heard from talking to experts and interviewing a bunch of people, we didn't see any kind of evidence that, that there was some sort of attack by Ukraine on Russia in the moments before that invasion, right? And certainly I can guarantee you that there was no conversation about that Ukraine was suddenly going to become a member, right? That's also something that I find really difficult to hear, because that wasn't something that was at least within the spot that I was sitting on the NATO desk. That was not something that was being taken seriously in the moment about Ukraine becoming a member in that moment, in that February 2022.
Yeah, so on that particular question, I guess I would just add to my colleague everything. I agree with everything she said, but I would add a detail that to me is absolutely critical on the last point. The French and the Germans were vehemently opposed to Ukraine joining NATO. They were opposed to Ukraine joining NATO up to the invasion in February 22. They made that clear both publicly and privately. Apparently there were, repeated direct assurances to Vladimir Putin that they were not going to allow it. And NATO requires all allies to agree for any member to join. So there was simply no prospect as of February 2022 of Ukraine joining NATO. NATO, surprisingly, NATO is far more likely to admit Ukraine today because of the war than it was before the war. So the idea that it was that one caused the other is ludicrous. The closest that I would get to it is to say that Vladimir Putin's objective, I think at this point it's pretty clear, is to control Ukraine. And he was afraid that something would limit his ability to control Ukraine at some point in the future, right? He wasn't afraid of NATO as a direct security threat to Russia. Just very quickly on the other two questions. So the follow-on one about expansion, I don't see the Ukraine issue changing very soon unless we see some really significant changes. Because as long as Ukraine continues to, first of all, as long as the war continues, Ukraine isn't going to join NATO. But even subsequently, some things would have to change for NATO to move the dial on a number of allies that I think currently would be. And even if there was some sort of a ceasefire, if that ceasefire which it most likely will, did not resolve the underlying territorial disputes, there's a problem there. So I don't really see that changing. And similarly, I know that Georgia would like to join the alliance, but I doubt there's going to be alliance support for enough all allies supporting on that. So I don't expect the alliance membership to be changing in the short term. Perhaps in the long term, those things will get resolved. And then finally on Hungary, just very quickly, I do think, I was talking about certain kinds of differences in threat perceptions and interests. Hungary and Viktor Orban in Hungary is definitely a real problem. It's a real challenge to have. There's really no way to deal with it within the alliance. And thus far, it has not been a limiter on the alliance's ability to do the things that it needs to do. For example, the Eastern Sentry reaction to those drone incursions that Professor Hardt mentioned, the alliance has been able to react against Russia rather robustly, I think. So it hasn't been an inhibitor thus far, and hopefully Viktor Orban will be gone from office before it ever would be a problem. I don't know if you have anything else to add on that. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe. The only other thing that I would add on Hungary is that when people talk about Hungary as being the spoiler or Turkey being the spoilers of NATO, it's true, right? I'm not saying that those countries are spoilers. I don't like that language, but I'm saying it's something you hear when we're at NATO-related conferences and things like that. Yes, the interests are different. Yes, we could have a whole conversation about democratic backsliding, but when push came to shove, if you take a look at what happened with Sweden and Finland's membership, those countries came on board, including Hungary, right? Yes, Hungary was one of the countries that was pushing back and had some questions, but Sweden and Finland were admitted. And sometimes in conversations, people will ask, well, I don't understand why were Sweden and Finland admitted, but then why not, say, a country like Ukraine or Georgia? Well, this goes back to what you just heard, which is that Ukraine has this territorial dispute, and then more importantly, it is actively at war, right? This is actively experiencing a war.
Allies, there's no allies. Okay, last question, round of questions. So we'll go, sir, and sir, ma'am. Okay, 4 questions up front.
Yes. One question that from a European side comes here to mind, obviously. You're absolutely right that NATO is working with its confinements and has deterred. The question here, Ukrainian war, and if you think some of the other challenges that NATO had or NATO troops had, is how do we deal with relentless totalitarian outsiders that are running into non-NATO countries? And I think one of the big problems that we have are our societies set up to maintain sustainably security for countries that we would like to influence, if we deem them important for our security, and willing to make the sacrifices to support these. And I think that is where NATO has significant challenges, and where, I mean, I'm just a humble guest here, but starting with Vietnam, if I lead a war where I'm not willing to conquer the opposing side, what is my goal? If I think of Afghanistan, what is my goal if I'm not willing to conquer where my opponent sits? And Ukraine is the exact same question. What is my goal? How do I define success in a case like this? And my question maybe to the general would be, do we have anything in the toolbox today that would give the population a feeling there's a goal to be achieved? Because that is heavily disputed. There's no doubt that there's no nuclear weapons raining on Europe, but clearly hybrid warfare has begun. It's ongoing. The security feeling is gone. We have significant issues on the hybrid side, but we have clearly no defined goal. And how long do we support something where we have no defined line what our achievement needs to be happy at the end of the day? I think that is a fundamental weakness in the strategy that we have. Inside NATO, we can think about it as long as we want. Either we declare these outside countries not to be Article 5 worthy. I mean, that's obviously one thing, but then we have to think about, do we really stretch the role of NATO into these?
Yeah. No, thank you for that. And perhaps it was an issue in Afghanistan as well on goals. Nobody has mentioned the word values either, but we forget the Article 1 and 2 part of NATO, and that's important. All right, sir.
What is missing, I think I'm following through on the gentleman who just spoke a moment ago. What is missing is unity and clarity, and there is a lack of clarity on mission, a lack of clarity on strategy, and a lack of clarity on communication. And what we have now is a Western alliance that shouts, "We're confused. We are in disagreement." And now we have an American president whose credibility is questioned, whose stability is questioned, and he is under tremendous pressure in the United States. My question is, if somebody decides, and that might be Russia, might be somebody else, to start a war now, could we get our boots on?
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Strategic ambiguity and what role that plays. No one's mentioned Taiwan here, and I just wondered if you could address that for just a second.
We're going to get to Taiwan just in the next panel, but I have two questions for you. I haven't heard a word about Turkey. It's almost as if Turkey doesn't exist, but I think it's a fairly important member of NATO. But my broader question, especially for the two panelists, is, and I don't know if you guys work on public opinion, but how strong is the commitment of the American people to NATO? You know, is the American public, do they understand NATO? You're talking about disinformation, Professor Hardt. So could you sell NATO to the American people today?
We're 5 minutes over, so if you all can condense.
Last question, I would say, stay tuned because I have a co-authored paper on U.S. public opinion with NATO that I'm working on. Yes. So, well, the good news is, I mean, you can look at Pew polls and Chicago, polls and things like that. So the good news is for those of you in the room who may believe that international institutions are really important, is that we still do have more than half of the American people who believe that, that the U.S. should continue to be a member of NATO and that the U.S. should still continue funding NATO. What we also have, which is why I'm writing the paper, is the largest partisan divide on record that we've ever seen in those polls on that question. So yes, Republicans still, they're just below 50% now. So it used to be always that NATO was a bipartisan support, right? It was not something that was considered partisan. And now we're seeing, it started in the, kind of under the first Trump administration. Now under the second Trump administration, it's got even bigger. So yes, stay tuned on that. I don't know if you want to answer the Taiwan question. Do you want to take any other ones? I can talk about ones, but
yeah. How to deal with, what's the goal? So, I mean, what I think we could imagine, right? I think we can agree that there's been a failure of communication, a failure of, right? But what I think the Europeans, for example, have realized since the Trump administration took office is doing whatever they can to keep Ukraine in the fight is absolutely in their interest. It's in our interest too, but in my opinion, the longer that Ukraine can continue to fight and keep Russia at bay, and even if it's just to hold on to the status quo, the better that is, because Russia can't then focus its resources on reconstituting and attacking NATO allies, right? So there needs to be better messaging. That is sort of a minimum goal, and then people need to talk about the broader goals. On the one hand, I will say I did not expect when Russia's full-scale invasion took place, I didn't expect the U.S. to provide as much military aid as we did to Ukraine for as long as we did without losing public support. So I was surprised. You go around and see the Ukraine flags everywhere, in where I am in rural Virginia, what's going on here. So there's part of it that is positive. Maybe just really quickly on Turkey, because again, I think it's an example of the diversity of the alliance's interests and its focus. I mean, just the geography alone, but Turkey is a perfect example of another country that is very much focused in terms of its security interests. Well, of course, Greece, but also the countries surrounding it, and not necessarily Russia. I mean, Russia's potentially among the threats that Turkey faces, but it's part of why NATO is developing, actually, Professor Hardt had it on one of her slides, more of a, recently it was called a action plan, but more of a orientation toward its southern flank as well. So it has partnership cooperative agreements with North African and Persian Gulf states, and that's a part of it, is trying to address the concerns that Turkey and other members have in the broader Mediterranean. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And just to wrap up, I think on strategic ambiguity, I think what is working in Taiwan for the history of our policy there might not work in Europe just the same way. I think the biggest danger of strategic ambiguity with respect to Article 5 would be we're just going to encourage further action and maybe the violation of borders someday of Russia. And I'll just close by saying something that I brought the Secretary General to Washington for a joint session of Congress, first time Secretary General was invited. And he, as always, very eloquent with his simplicities, he closed by saying, "It is good to have friends." And so I'm glad that we were able to talk about our most successful alliance and having friends. Thank you all. Thank you for the panels.